otherwise the firm will make such a lot of profits in the interim that it couldn't be, who cheated will make so many profits in the interim that they can't make up for that by punishing them later, right? So the more patient people are, or the more frequently the firms interact, the easier it will be to sustain collusion, because the easier it'll be to punish the person quickly, right? The more often people change prices, or the more that they're competing, right? So, yeah, Jim.
So I know we usually think of cartels as being bad, but this framework looks really similar to like some sort of multinational agreement to like reduce ozone.
Exactly.
Or something. So in that case, we would be on the cartel side, so to speak, like hoping for a
Yeah. So the theory of cartels is basically the theory of public action more generally, right? Basically, thinking about a cartel is just a public good that is a pecuniary externality, and therefore we don't want internalized, right? So I think you can think of everything in terms of cartels as just being exactly the same as the theory of public action. It's just that cartels are internalizing an externality that we don't want internalized. So Stigler's theory of collusion is based on these necessities. And he uses these to identify a number of factors which might facilitate or hinder collusion. So, for example, he says that if buyers are very large and heterogeneous, this might hurt the ability to collude. Why is that? Well, someone is going to have a really big incentive that if they can steal all of one customer's business, that will make a really big difference to their profitability. And that will make it very tempting to defect from a collusive agreement. Whereas if the buyer, and also it'll be hard to sort of divide up the spoils of the market in a very sort of fair way if there are these lumpy big consumers, right? On the other hand, small homogeneous consumers help them divide things up nicely. Now actually, sometimes the best possible thing for the cartel would be if there were exactly as many consumers as there are producers, and like each one can establish a relationship with one, and that they can use that as exclusive territories, basically. Heterogeneity of the product or the firms can hurt the ability to collude, because it makes it harder to define the optimum when all the firms are selling completely different types of products. Then I need to know everything about the other firm's cost functions. I need to know exactly how we should divide up the market, even though everyone has different markups. That can make it much harder to reach an agreement. If everyone has sort of very similar situation, if it's much more symmetric, then it's much easier to sort of both know and to write down in a simple way what a reasonable collusive agreement is. Price transparency makes it easier to track defections. So before we said that firms would have more market power if pricing wasn't very transparent, because it would force consumers to search and whatever. But one potential benefit of benefit of prices being non-transparent is it makes it hard for the firms to monitor if the other firms are cheating. And in particular, transparency to consumers might be good, but transparency to other firms is bad, right? Industry concentration also helps. If the industry is concentrated, there's only a few players, it's easier to be monitoring everyone. If we have to monitor a huge number of people, that can be very difficult. And if there's a large number of people, then any one firm could have a very large temptation to break the agreement and get a large part of the profits. Whereas if there's a small number of firms, that temptation is going to be smaller because you capture a larger part of the impact that you have on the industry as a whole. If demand is very variable over time, if it sort of comes and goes in waves, that can hurt monitoring because it becomes very easy to distinguish to disguise anytime that you're cheating as just being a result of one of these demand fluctuations. The more frequent people interact with each other, the easier it is to detect the violations of the agreement soon. Growing demand is helpful. Declining demand is harmful. Because if the demand in the industry is growing, then I'm going to be willing to collude with you now in order to make sure that we maintain our agreement in the future. If the industry is declining, then we don't have much value of maintaining our collusive relationship, and we're all very tempted to grab what we can while we can. Okay. So all of these are going to determine the extent to which firms are able to deter one another from violating collusive agreements. And most deterrence occurs through firms having price wars, right? So if one firm lowers its price, then the other firm retaliates by lowering its prices as well. So a simple way to summarize this into a static model, remember that we interpret static models as what do I think is the average effect that doing something will have on something else over some period of time, right? So if a firm thinks that when it lowers its price, typically that'll lead other firms to also lower their price. A simple way to summarize that is by what's called conjectural variations, right? So conjectural variations is just a simple way of summarizing the idea that on average over the length of time when I'm setting my price, having a lower price will lead other firms' prices to be lower as well. And so we usually capture this by some parameter that measures how much other firms' price would adjust when my price adjusts. And of course, you could do that in a quantity model as well. If you thought in a Cournot model that when I reduce my quantity, other firms will accommodate that by reducing their quantity, right, on average, then that will lead to that will summarize a more collusive setting, right? So the conjectural variations framework is a broad framework that can incorporate all of these different theories, and it can be used to talk about them all at the same time without listing off all the individual factors. We can sort of think of the conjectural variations parameter as being a metric of how much collusion there is that will have some empirical relationship to each of these factors that we were discussing. Okay, so let's consider the simplest Cournot model where, again, my profits depend on the quantity of everyone else, my own quantity, and my cost. But now let's assume that rather than me taking other firms' quantity as given, let's say that I believe that their quantity will change when my quantity changes, right? So, Chrissy, what's going to be my optimal pricing then? You can do it on the board if you want. Or
this route by totally differentiating?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How much of this so far is specifically about competing firms? Couldn't these be complementary firms with complementary goods? And
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that formula there is clearly about competing firms, right? Because the price depends on the sum of the quantities. But when we talked about the differentiated product model, it was only a sign assumption there that got us that the firms were competing.
And the Sherman Act bans all trust.
No.
Or is it
Complementary goods are called vertical, and those are not restricted by the Sherman Act. They're restricted by the Clayton Act.
right? Yeah.
And they're not as much restricted. And there's good reasons for that.
Right. But would we still call it
Col-
vertical collusion?
Yeah, you could call it vertical collusion. Oh, you're so close, Chrissy. You're just missing one little mark, but it's beautiful. One little mark. P prime. Yeah, but that's great.
And we can move things around.
Yeah, no, that's great. You did a great job. So so what Chrissy did was she said that you still have the price minus cost, but then you have P prime multiplied by Q. But now rather than just being P prime times Q, it's P prime times Q times 1 plus however much changing your quantity affects the quantity of other firms, right? So if my quantity, if when I increase my quantity, other firms increase their quantity, then this will be a larger number, and marginal revenue will be even further below price than it was under monopoly. Sorry, under Cournot competition, right? And that'll lead to collusion. Because if when I increase my quantity, am retaliated on by other people who increase their quantity, that leads me to be more collusive, right? That's called an accommodating reaction. On the other hand, if other firms are not accommodating but aggressive, so that when I reduce my quantity, the other firms increase their quantity to make up for that, right? Then I'm going to actually charge a lower price than I would otherwise have charged. And that's basically what happens in Bertrand. In Bertrand, when I reduce my quantity, other firms increase their quantity because when they hold their price fixed, my reduction in quantity is met by an increase in their quantity, right? So the Bertrand model can just be viewed as a Cournot model with a conjectural parameter of -1, right? Now, we could also start from the Bertrand or the differentiated Bertrand model and have conjectures there too. Okay. So this conduct parameter summarizes the degree of collusion. But as you notice, we could also, by changing this conjectural variations, move between the different static models of competition. So what that suggests is that what really is going to, in the end, matter is sort of the overall degree of competitiveness of a market, rather than exactly whether it's collusion or a different static interpretation or whatever that leads the industry to be closer to monopoly or closer to competition, right? So market power can arise from Cournot when there's few firms. It can arise from firms having very differentiated products. Because if they have very differentiated products, they're not going to compete as intensely, right? Because their residual elasticity is going to be very close, almost as inelastic as the industry-wide elasticity will be, right? Collusion or conjectures can also lead to market power, right? Or search frictions could lead to market power. Or heterogeneous costs can lead to market power. There's lots of different sources of market power, right? And with complementarity, you can get even more market power for reasons we'll talk about in lecture 16 and Carl was alluding to, right? So for many purposes, it's really the level of the market power created rather than the exact source of it that's important. And to summarize this level, we really have to think about these real versus pecuniary externalities that we were talking about before. So let's begin by focusing on symmetric oligopoly. Now, in symmetric oligopoly, there are basically two effects that a firm has when it changes its price or its quantity or whatever its strategy is on other firms. There's first a set of real effects, right? The real effects are the change in industry quantity multiplied by the markup that all the firms are earning. So in symmetric oligopoly, every firm, let's say,